Noël Valis is a professor here at Yale University. Her research interests are centered on modern Spanish literature, culture, and history, as well as the relationship between religion and literature, and celebrity and cultural icons. Noël Valis is a corresponding member of the Royal Spanish Academy. She's a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow, and a Senior Fellow at the Elm Institute. She received a presidential appointment of the NEH's National Council on the Humanities in 2019. From personal experience, I can also tell you she's a brilliant professor of Spanish playwright Federico Garcia Lorca and a close mentor. Please welcome Noël Valis.
Thank you, Raphael. Can you hear me all right? Yes? Can you hear me? Okay, great. When Lauren kindly invited me to participate in this year's Buckley Program annual conference on the road to serfdom at 75, the future of classical liberalism in the free market, I said I'd gladly do so, but in case she wasn't aware, I'm not an economist. I can't even balance my checkbook, as I seem always to come up with excess amounts persistently flatlining in the picayune financial zones of $1.32 or $2.57. If my checkbook remains a mystery, the free market is simply an abyss. Or so my high school teacher of history, who also taught economics, concluded in examining my meager economic talents. Mr. Dougherty, who was an ex-Marine and a World War II vet, punctuated his teaching periodically with the phrase, "Tell it to the Marines," a piece of advice I failed to follow. It was only much later that I learned there were two ways of understanding that phrase, one negative and the other positive. No doubt Mr. Dougherty meant the latter because he was a tough Marine himself. He wasn't born yesterday. I mention this because among the many readers F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom has attracted were, as Milton Friedman wrote, the young men and women who had been in the armed forces during World War II. They had a pretty clear idea what they were fighting for, and it certainly wasn't to give up their freedom. Hayek's book was written while we were at war, when the differences between the opposing sides were stark, but he also believed that the very totalitarian collectivism against which we fought had already wormed its way into the fabric of liberalism. By liberalism, he meant the 19th century classical form based in individualism, not its co-optation as a pretext to expand government control. He saw individual freedom as inextricably connected to economic freedom, but he also maintained, he said, that we have progressively abandoned that freedom in economic affairs, without which personal and political freedom has never existed in the past. One of his sharper insights focuses on the notion that the ultimate ends, he says, of the activities of reasonable beings are never economic. Economic motives exist to achieve other ends. But if economic power becomes more and more centralized, those ends, so precious to the individual lives of others, do as well. How and where we live, where we work, and how we choose to travel, and ultimately what we think or are permitted to think, become subject to the greater will of those who already believe they know what everyone else should do or think. Tell that to the Marines. Because the roots of classical liberalism are individualist, there is nothing in the basic principles of liberalism, Hayek wrote, to make it a stationary creed. There are no hard and fast rules fixed once and for all. The fundamental principle that in the ordering of our affairs, we should make as much use as possible of the spontaneous forces of society and resort as little as possible to coercion is capable of an infinite variety of applications. The political economic dynamics of liberalism, however, produce a kind of built-in forgetting of its own role as a model of change and progress. Thus, Hayek observed, it might even be said that the very success of liberalism became the cause of its decline. But we might also ask, is liberalism's own inability to ward off internal threats to the basic tenets of liberalism because of a flawed understanding of what liberalism is, or because liberalism has always had an exposed flank in believing that the openness of liberalism means openness to all ideas, even those that will destroy liberalism itself? Is it liberalism that keeps redefining itself in the US, or other ideological forces that have done so, to the point of being unrecognizable, the very opposite of what classical liberalism is? For many of us, the most disturbing thing about liberalism today is that it has produced illiberal thinking. How has that happened? Many of the same people who currently advocate socialistic practices in our economy also appear to espouse the curtailment of free speech. The relation between controlling the economy and controlling thought merits further reflection. In making economic freedom the prerequisite of any other freedom, Hayek, if I understand him correctly, it seems to me, perhaps puts the cart before the horse. What makes people end up centralizing the economy? Isn't it first because they want or already have succeeded in controlling the way people think? Contempt for intellectual liberty, to use a phrase of Hayek, strikes me as the prerequisite for a similar contempt for other forms of liberty. There is a certain mindset shared in the overregulation of thought and economic activity. All is justifiable, even political and economic oppression itself, in the name of whatever so-called virtuous system of groupthink is being promoted. The current rash of identity politics as an expression of social justice are the ice flows of collectivist thinking. The very virtue of liberalism, its individualist foundation, appears to have become its own worst enemy. Is the supreme emphasis on the individual the weak link, removing the constraints to liberalism's own liberal tenets? Hayek reminds us that the values of individualism are also social virtues, that kindliness and respect for one's neighbors, he says, smooth social contacts and make control from above less necessary and at the same time more difficult. But given the fractured society in which we live today, is that enough to protect the personal and economic freedom, enabling us to build up our own little worlds? I know what Mr. Dougherty would say. He'd say, tell it to the Marines. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists, our first one, all of whom are going to be speaking on this topic, classical liberalism today, is success the cause of its decline? And I should point out that one of our panelists is not yet here, Sohrab Ahmari, but he is on his way. So he will be speaking last since he will be arriving a few minutes late. And since the program lists everybody in alphabetical order, I'm going to follow it and start, in that case, with Ross. Ross Douthat, who joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April 2009. He's also been an editor, a senior editor at The Atlantic, and a blogger for TheAtlantic.com. He's the author of Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, and To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. He's a co-author with Raihan Salam of Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. Ross grew up in New Haven. Ross?
Thank you. Oh, I'm to go before the others are introduced.
Yeah.
It's a high risk. It's a high risk move.
Oh.
I might never let them be introduced. I could just no. So thank you so much for that very illuminating introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to my fellow panelists for being here. I think that there are a number of ways that you could think about what it means for a worldview or a system to become a victim of its own success. And I think we've just heard, sketched out in certain ways, hints of one version that's been applied to liberalism over the years, the idea that, in effect, in championing individualism, it opens the door to collectivism by leaving people, in a sense, atomized, fragmented, isolated, and therefore more inclined to new forms of collectivism, new totalizing ideologies, and so on. And if you go back, this has been a recurring concern. If you go back and read, for instance, Robert Nisbet, one of the great sort of conservative sociologists of the mid-20th century, he offered sort of a version of this argument to explain how the flourishing of 19th century liberalism, sort of Manchester School economics and political liberalism and so on, could give rise to the age of totalitarianism that he was then living through. And you come to sort of, whenever liberalism enters a period of crisis, you come, I think, to similar variations on this argument. If you look at some of the sort of so-called neoconservative writers of the 1970s, in different ways, Daniel Bell and Irving Kristol worried or argued that it was possible that free market capitalism could gradually undercut the moral virtues necessary to maintain a capitalist economy. And I think similarly, we've come around to versions of that argument today. I want to suggest a related but slightly different way of looking at the underlying situation, because I'm a little bit skeptical that liberalism as we know it is truly in crisis at the moment, notwithstanding how things are presented on Twitter and maybe occasionally in the pages of my own newspaper and maybe occasionally on Yale's campus. It seems to me that if you look at the Western world, the developed world, you can fold in Japan, South Korea, parts of the Pacific Rim, what you see is less a crisis than, in a weird way, a desire for crisis, a desire for action and activity that's sort of layered on top of a reality that's much more stagnant and sclerotic and exhausted than, again, you would think from the way people are fighting about politics online. And the sense in which I think liberal democratic capitalism is a victim of its own success right now is more in the line of exhaustion, fatigue, and decadence than it is in the line of totalitarian-style crisis. And I think you can see this if you sort of step out of the realm of political philosophy and into a realm that was obviously of great interest to Hayek as well, which is just sort of the basics of economics. Welcome, Sohrab. And
we were all going to talk smack about you for a while.
No, I'm glad he's here, because I was afraid I was going to have to, play the part of the critic of capitalism, but I won't have to play that role. I think if you look at the pattern of life, the pattern of economic life in the developed world right now, you can tell a pretty straightforward story where the conditions of great wealth don't lead to sort of, the kind of, I think, moral and sociological and social collapse that people worried about during, let's say, the crime waves of the 1960s and 70s, but lead instead to sort of exhaustion and senility on a society-wide scale. The societies that are wealthy and powerful are places where people become less likely to do things like have children, right? And so those societies get older very quickly. And as those societies get older very quickly, they become less dynamic and inventive and less likely to, develop the hot new entrepreneurial idea, or less likely to, embrace the next version of the Apollo program and so on. And I think there's a sense in which in that sense, we're still sort of in the kind of decadent, stagnant, Francis Fukuyama's end of history version of where liberalism ends, where you have very wealthy societies that have ceased to be as dynamic and entrepreneurial as they used to be, that are sort of growing old in comfort and feel unhappy about that and sort of aware that something is amiss and something isn't right. And so they sort of lash out and sort of lurch backward towards ideas from the past, socialism, certain forms of political nationalism, certain ideas of religious revival, but they don't actually find real purchase. There's a lot more sort of play acting in a sense, and people are sort of, and the internet then contributes to this, because the internet is a great zone of play acting and performance where people can reenact 1968 on Twitter or reenact the 1930s on Facebook, and nobody actually has to get hurt. And I don't want to push this too far, because obviously there are, if you look at everything from the Gilets jaunes in France to the protests roiling Chile, there are real, there's real political violence in the West today. People are taking to the streets, governments are falling, and so on. It isn't sort of a perfect stagnation, and it could be that in a few years I'll look back on this analysis and say that in a way I was too sanguine, and the crisis is really, more dramatic and readily apparent. But I feel like there's a way in which, people in my profession spend a lot of time sitting and writing columns about the crisis of liberalism from nice coffee shops in cities where everything seems to be going pretty well. And, if you look at the United Kingdom, for instance, Brexit is in certain ways the most extreme constitutional crisis that Britain has faced since the 18th or 17th century. But if you visit London, you wouldn't know it. Everything sort of seems to be going on as it did before. And that's what I want to suggest to you today as, at the very least, a provocation, that the crisis of our times may be more about sort of discontent with old age and exhaustion than it is about people really coming around to collectivism or totalitarianism or anything like that. And if so, I think it's an interesting question what free market economics and classical liberal thought has to say about that, because I'm not completely sure what the answer is myself. What does a sort of optimistic vision of a capitalist future say about a society where people are freely making choices that are leading to economic stagnation and sort of repetition and decay? I'm not sure what the answer is to that, and I'll leave that as my question and turn things over to everyone else. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, let's see. I can't do the alphabet today, but Sohrab, you were actually going to go first, but you'll probably end up going last here because to give you a moment here. So let me pass to Amity Shlaes, who's the chair of the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, which gives merit scholarships. Her newest book is The Great Society, A New History. She's also the author of 5 previous books, 4 of which are New York Times bestsellers: Germany, The Empire Within, The Greedy Hand, Why Taxes Drive Americans Crazy, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, which is a wonderful book I read many years ago, Coolidge, and The Forgotten Man, a graphic novel, which I must get hold of. She's a former editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal and a Yale graduate, class of '82.
Can you hear me? I felt the compulsion to write an essay. I was listening to Ross, but I'm going to switch and just give an answer and an anecdote in my time. I'm grateful to be here, glad to be near Yale, glad to get to know Professor Noël and to see Lauren and what an achievement this institution represents already. So the question was, in my email, is classical liberalism a casualty of its own success? And my answer, too, would be no, at least not in the sense that the word casualty means death. I would say classical liberalism is hostage to its own success. The captors, whoever they are, render liberalism inactive, maybe fatigued, as Ross said, sideline it, and in our way, whatever we are, free marketeers, conservatives, participate in that sidelining of classical liberalism because it sounds old, because it didn't succeed entirely. There's a kind of frustration that happens in a political discussion and a cultural discussion. Conservatives or free marketeers or all the church or any other Tocqueville conservatives are frustrated at liberalism's prior failures. So we define ourselves or say the next movement will be hardcore libertarianism or natalism or protectionism or populism or mercantilism or just a good show. Ideas to come later. But this dynamic, I'm so glad to be here for Hayek, does obscure a fact. Classical liberalism is for the individual is still the engine, therefore classical liberalism is, was, and can be in the future the optimal doctrine for the United States. The future part, however, can only happen if we, including some of us in this room, don't accept the death certificate. We say the casualty is just a casualty, wounded, hostage, sidelined. That's the one comment. The story relates. It's from my new book. I'm going to be an author and hold it up. It's a history of the Great Society. It's the sequel to Forgotten Man. This is the first chapter, essentially. The story starts in 59 or 1960, in some ways a moment which resembles the current one when classical liberalism to, at least say in boardrooms or in Mad Men land, seemed futile. There's a company in this story, it was General Electric, an enormously successful company that Americans treated as an icon, like baseball. It made parts for the Gemini and then Apollo space programs. It made turbines for the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is to say a government institution, an administrative state institution, Charlie. And it represented America's, open quote, military industrial success, I would say. That is, it was not just working with the government, it was almost together with the government in some sort of corporate way. When we had the kitchen in Moscow, when Nikita Khrushchev went and Nixon, the lemon yellow kitchen was the GE kitchen, right? It was just the emblem. And General Electric executives at that time, some of your fathers may have been these executives, like executives at most companies at that time did hold a set view about how the economy worked. The big companies would get at a table like this, but maybe round. They would meet with the union and the government, three parties at the table, a so-called tripod or big three, and they would set everything. Prices, wages, rate of growth, you name it. And the wages might be high, but this is the United States. We will never have any competition anyhow. And that was the way they viewed the economy. But there was one executive at GE who saw things differently. His name itself was absurd. His name was Lemuel Ricketts Boulware. Boulware was an older fellow. He believed growth didn't come when government, companies, and unions sat at that table. They lacked sufficient knowledge to get optimal growth. He believed growth took place when a lone scientist kind of flying the world in his lab invented, say, the light bulb. That is the old GE, the inventor's GE. He believed the company-government-union relationship was creeping socialism, and he used that word, which was then a rough word. It was considered red baiting, and that it would gradually kill American competitiveness. The reason our 1959 kitchens were better than Russia's 1959 kitchens was that the original long-term investments of GE were still giving back. But that might not last forever. So to Boulware, an older, lonely executive, he believed it was the God-given assignment of a pristine company like GE, a national hero, to inspire America to fight for capitalism, to fend off socialism, 59 and 60. And the problem was urgent. I'll just read you one quote from him at the time. The current rapid trend has got to be changed or we are through with everything we cherish. Very strong-minded guy. The younger executives at GE found him ridiculous. He was very close to retirement, Boulware. He was going to Delray Beach. They were just waiting for the days. He was no threat, and they did not think capitalism needed saving, period. But Boulware did determine to use his last years to make a long-term investment in saving America's future, even if it didn't appear to need saving. And he had the backing of the chairman. So he spent millions of funds printing pamphlets explaining the value of markets and freedom to the over 100,000 GE employees. He printed up pages and pages of these documents, distributed all manner of Hayek and Adam Smith to workers in the there are over 100 GE plants, traveled up and down, argued, worried told the workers that high wages would force the companies to leave and go west. One of the pamphlets I found in my research was it was for Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and it was a warning pamphlet, and it said, "Grass will grow in Pittsfield. Companies will leave if you don't reduce the wages in Pittsfield." Pittsfield is becoming uncompetitive. He created a Sunday TV show, and some of you will know this story, called GE Theater, which was a kind of moralizing version, minus the science fiction, of the Twilight Zone, right? And he hired an aging actor to serve as GE spokesman. He also worked on the foundation of a new magazine to give the actor something to read that was National Review. The actor was a New Deal Democrat. I won't be disingenuous. It was the aging Ron Reagan. Reagan did not really agree with these fiery Billwareisms, but he had to internalize it for the money. He had a new family. So he lectured against communism. He lectured against the Tennessee Valley Authority as a government agency of the administrative state. He lectured against Medicare, which was about to be introduced, and so on. And he kind of internalized it, let's just say. And then a terrible blow came for Boulware and for GE. The government, which was, to be specific, the Attorney General, who happened to be Bobby Kennedy, charged GE, supposedly pristine, with colluding antitrust and fixing prices of what it sold to the TVA. Oh my gosh, and the case was strong. They did collude, GE salesmen, with Westinghouse. They went to jail. GE was besmirched. Ronald Reagan was fired. If you're a hypocrite and you preach free markets and make fun of the TVA, you can't, with your other hand, or simultaneously cheat GE in a creepy, colluding way, can you? People compare GE to baseball, to the Black Sox, to 1919. Boulware got pneumonia and lived in Delray Beach in his retirement. And it was a kind of bitter, quiet retirement because the government then went ahead and did all the things he had warned against in the Great Society. But his little effort, his little William Buckley group, his little National Review was not in vain, because in addition to internalizing the GE line, Reagan had come to believe it. His GE speech was converted into the very important speech Reagan gave in 1964, Time for Choosing. It was the speech he used when he campaigned for the so-called Creative Society for governor of California, and his constituents, when he ran for president and won in 1980, were often workers who had had those little handbooks that Lem Boulware had handed out so many years ago and had thought about it and thought they might see something in Adam Smith or his popularizer Henry Hazlitt as well. The forgotten little investment of Boulware, the man who was mocked by all his colleagues, yielded returns unimaginable to free markets, let's say, and classical liberalism as well. So what does this tell us? First of all, that all little efforts everyone in this room are engaged in, those are perhaps worthwhile. You can't know that a scribbling now may be of great value later. I think it also tells you you can't write off classical liberalism early. As I mentioned, Boulware and Reagan, for that matter, were dismissed definitively as retro in 1961 and 1962. And the third is that if you participate in these ventures, however unpopular they may be, and then you pass from the scene, you may not be forgotten. And the proof of that is here I am in New Haven, 2019, talking about and remembering not only Reagan, not only Hayek, but Lem Bulware. Thank you.
I'm just thinking that perhaps in the interest of time, since this is all in the program anyway, maybe we don't need to read the introduction.
You sure?
I'm very famous, so I think...
I don't need to say anything about the man. Isn't that fantastic? Well, you know this is Kevin Williamson, right?
Hey.
Okay, from the National Review.
Thanks. So the thing about liberalism is that it comes as part of a package deal, unfortunately, in the form of liberal democracy. And so if the question is liberalism a victim of its own success, we have to look at it slightly more broadly. And the answer, I think, is that liberal democracy is in part a victim of the success of liberalism, but it's also a victim of the failures of democracy. Liberalism is a victim of its own success to the extent that the liberal economic regime creates the conditions under which the desire for most ordinary goods can be relatively well satisfied for the majority of the people in the aggregate. So if we don't have enough bread and people want more of it, then the price system works, as Hayek pointed out. More land is brought under cultivation, we build more bakeries, there's more bread, prices reach an equilibrium, people get what they want. That holds true for most ordinary goods, and at some point, when the provision of the basic necessities and comforts of material life become relatively easy and relatively cheap, then people begin to compete in a different realm, in a realm of metaphysical goods, most prominently in the realm of status. And status is an interesting competition problem because status is, by definition, always relative. So if someone raises a little bit, then everyone else is by implication relatively lowered. What this means is that the desire for status can never be satisfied in the aggregate because it is a zero-sum game. It's not like cars or cell phones or corn or automobiles or anything else. And so we have reached the point in our social evolution that our politics now is principally about the competition for status. And when that happens, you have a politics that is no longer about the pursuit of some definite positive project, but instead that really is about covering up the failures of your current political discourse, because the politics of status competition require people to make promises that are by definition not deliverable. So what that ends up with, and this is intensified in our particular moment, I should add, by the development of things like what we call, for lack of a better term, globalization, but also social media, the increasingly mobile and delocalized nature of the American upper class, which is to say that we are now, many of us, citizens of a larger, single, and more connected community than citizens of more multiple, smaller, localized communities, which means that the number of available high-status positions is smaller, which intensifies this competition. So we reach the point where politics now becomes about embarrassment. It's about the inability of the political class to deliver on the absurd promises that it makes. So if you can't actually raise the status of the people you claim to represent, one thing you can do is work to lower the status of the people who are their perceived enemies, which of course is what our politics is entirely about right now. It's the invitation to associate with high-status individuals or institutions or endeavors. This is the I love science people. I can't, solve a basic first-order differential equation, but I'll tell you why, relativity is very important, these folks. And but then on the other side, you get this really strange, perverse expression of it. One of the odd things about the United States right now politically is that the real loci of American power and excellence tend to be associated with communities and individuals who are politically on the left. And so we have this very, very strange situation of these self-confessed American nationalists who actually despise and condescend to everything that is actually extraordinary and powerful and outstanding about the United States. So we're nationalists, but we hate Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the Ivy League, pretty much every city larger than Lubbock, Texas, California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut I get, but I used to live here, and I checked into the hotel and they said, "You should go to the 19th floor, there's a view." I said, "Really? Of what?" So our nationalists actually end up having to despise a lot of what actually is good and excellent and outstanding and unusual about the United States, the parts of the United States that are actually envied by the rest of the world, that the rest of the world would really very much like to replicate because they're associated with the wrong kind of politics and therefore the wrong sort of tribe. That this makes for a brand of politics that is irritating and useless and depressing and intellectually vacuous, I think should be, obvious from a daily perusal of Ross's excellent newspaper. But I'm a subscriber. I like the New York Times. So we have it on no less an authority than that of John Adams that the American system is designed for people who are, as he put it, moral and religious, which strikes people as very old-fashioned sometimes, I think. And we hear a lot of that quote from the right because it's used as a kind of sop to people to say, well, maybe you don't actually believe this religious stuff, but it's useful, so come on and buy into what you may actually think are lies about the nature of the universe, but there's practical applications for it. I think one of the things that it's worth keeping in mind is that it's not necessarily for a person to be a religious believer to enter into a religious error. And I would argue that that is actually the dominant error and idea of American politics right now, what should be known and would be known, for lack of a better word, as idolatry. If you read the Old Testament, the great object of idolatry in the Old Testament isn't the famous golden calf. It's Pharaoh. It's the idea that a ruler and a state and a leader is the source of well-being, is the source of material progress, is the source of social peace and all the rest of it. And our political ethic on both sides of the aisle right now is essentially one of idolatry, of which we look at the president as a kind of pharaoh, and we look at the state as a kind of pharaoh to represent us in some metaphysical and moral way, rather than to be the guy who's actually just in charge of an administrative apparatus that we need because it's hard to get stuff done without it. This romantic, totalizing, superstitious, mythical understanding of the state and of the presidency and its role is, I think, it's decadence, as Ross would put it, but it's a disease of affluence. It's something you get to once you're rich enough to stop worrying about feeding yourself, housing yourself, clothing yourself, and doing the rest of those sorts of things. And so we enter into this fanciful period of our history in which we are replicating very, very ancient errors in new and creative ways. That's all.
Yeah. All right. So now we have Sohrab Ahmari, who is the op-ed editor of the New York Post and has written a memoir of his Catholic conversion called From Fire by Water, and I will leave it at that, so to give you all enough time.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. I have to apologize for coming in so last minute. Maybe Lauren told you, but I had booked an Amtrak train, and then it was unaccountably canceled. They said it was downed wires, whatever that means. And then I booked a Bolt bus, and that was an hour late. So anyway, I apologize, but I'm so happy to be here with everyone else. So before addressing the question that's the topic of the debate, I want to put forward a general proposition, and then I will get to the question in the debate. And the general proposition is almost too simple, but bear with me. It's that limits make us free. They're the anvils on which we hammer the individual shapes of our lives, and they protect us against tyrannies of various kinds. Limitless autonomy, by contrast, is a kind of prison. Limits, boundaries, are a source of freedom and adventure. So that's my basic proposition. Now, those of you who are fans of G.K. Chesterton will immediately recognize that as a deeply Chestertonian argument. In his book Orthodoxy, he sets out to address why the Catholic Church takes the shape that it does, with its fusty hierarchies and its severe monsignori and everything else. And his point is that religion is actually a very dangerous thing. It can be a source of great inspiration, great acts of martyrdom and courage and asceticism, but it can also lead to wacky places. And so to keep this very powerful thing under control in just the right balance, you need that fusty hierarchy. That's his argument. But that argument translates in many different realms of life. It is not just limited to the Catholic Christianity that Chesterton championed. Anyone who's had children or has children or who has taught school children, and I've done both of those things, both as a blessing and for my sins, knows that they thrive under limits and they suffer from limitless autonomy, and they make you suffer too. So something, and this as basic a topic for nearly all Western Judeo-Christian philosophy, something in human nature longs for laws, for limits, and for order. It's why the psalmist sings, "I shall walk in liberty, for I have sought thy precepts." It's why Cicero says, "Finally, for this reason we became slaves of the law, that we might be free." And the law in this sense doesn't necessarily just mean rules and regulations that govern any criminal life or criminal justice or the economy and so forth, but law in a sort of deeper sense of structure. So that brings me to my answer to the question at hand, and it's a subtle and paradoxical one, and it's this: that if the goal of classical liberalism is to promote freedom, accept that proposition, to the extent that the liberalism of today is destructive of all natural and traditional boundaries and dismisses calls for such limits as theocracy and so forth, it fails to protect freedom and in fact undoes its own noble aim, which is the promotion of freedom. So I'll give you a few examples of processes that in each case liberalism has set out to promote individual liberty but has paradoxically come to restrict it or repress it. One might be the sexual revolution. You can say, well, the sexual revolution was a child of the 60s, but in some ways it's deeply attuned to liberalism's autonomy maximizing urges. And the idea was to liberate men and women, but the practical result was to empower caddish men. And then the result from that was the various backlash movements, most recently Me Too, which seek to then regulate every aspect of the encounter between men and women to such a degree that then there's no room for such things as mercy, for due process, and so forth. So the impulse towards this kind of autonomistic liberationism ends up requiring a vast administrative state to regulate something that tradition did in a very natural way. In the university, right, the collapse of the old authoritarian master or professor has not brought forward absolute freedom of thought, but this enormous bulge of administrators that, again, regulate university life and the way people think to a degree that's inimical to the liberal mission of the university. In the economy, this might be more controversial in this room, but the limitless autonomy has brought us to a point where major American corporations censor freedom of speech on issues fundamental to freedom, like what happened with Hong Kong. You have Nike kowtowing to the communist Chinese. You had, I think, in a very revealing statement, you had 200 CEOs a while ago took out an ad in the New York Times where they said these new restrictive abortion laws in certain states in the South are bad for business. Or in Ireland, where some corporations have been accused by female pilots of being forced to choose between their jobs or seeking an abortion. So this fundamental limit, again, once it's gone, and again, the economy itself is not bound to any idea of moral order, you actually end up encroaching on the freedoms that people who are economic liberals would naturally want to promote. And which brings me to my last example, in a way. It's the loss of the Sabbath. And when I say the Sabbath, I don't just mean the loss of blue laws per se, but those two as well, but just the idea that life needs to have some limit beyond which you take a break from it. And so I also have to cite the Old Testament as well. It's very important to know in the dialogue between Moses and Pharaoh, a lot of people assume that Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go so we can go to the promised land." But those of you who are here, I'm sure you are biblically literate. In fact, as Pope Benedict points out, that's not the question. It's let my people go so that we can go worship the Lord our God in the wilderness. And Pharaoh is a practical man. He negotiates. He says, "Okay, why don't you do it here?" And Moses says, "No, we got to go in the wilderness." And Pharaoh says, "All right, but only the men go. Leave the women and children here." Moses says, "All of us." He says, "Okay, all of you go, but keep your livestock here." Again, Moses says no. So what does that mean for us here? It means that submission to God, for one thing, prefigured or guaranteed the political freedom to come in the promised land. In other words, the ultimate limit of submission to God wins Israel is political freedom. It also suggests, secondly, that submission to God, when it's non-negotiable, becomes freedom's guarantor, whether that's for the Jewish refusnik, braving torture to worship God in the Gulag, or Moses' people in bondage, or indeed for us today, in bondage to our own excessive, disordered liberties. And so we conservatives, if we are to recover the limits that actually sustain freedom, must begin by reordering our project, I think, to that ultimate limit, the ultimate liberating horizon, and remind our fellow citizens that man is made for more than this world, and his destiny is in the hands of the Almighty. Or, as the great sage Kanye put it, close on Sunday, you my Chick-fil-A. Thank you.
Well, there's much here, much food for thought, I would say, and a number of different points that have been made here. Well, we'll have to see with your questions and discussion how much of these can be brought together and how much of these don't seem to be able to be brought together. I mean, we started with Ross talking about individualism and the exhaustion of the atomizing kind of society that we seem to have, the loss of community, in other words, whereas Amity has stressed the importance of the individual. So we'll have to see how, if there are questions and comments about these kind of notions that seem almost in tension to some degree. Kevin has spoken about the tribalism of the current liberal democracy, at least in this country and probably elsewhere, and Sohrab on the need for limitations, whereas I suspect that this whole obsession with status refuses to see any limitations. But these are all of great interest, and I would like to know if you also find them of interest. And so we open up the floor to questions and answers. First one.
Thank you. This is for Mr. Douthat. I was wondering about your point about the current crisis being caused by a sense of senility and exhaustion. So we've had Yuval Levin speak to us, and he attributes a lot of this to the fact that the baby boomers are the largest generation and are now aging and exert some sort of undue cultural influence. I'm wondering where you see the source of this inertia coming from.
Yeah, I mean, look, I defer to Yuval on all things, so I'm sure he's right. I think that it is. I mean, I think you could look at the baby boomers in this light, and I had quoted Robert Nisbet earlier, and I'm going to steal a different idea from him again. But basically, in one of his essays, he makes the argument that you get moments of intense sort of dynamism and creativity in societies when you have different forces that are sort of equal in strength colliding. I think he calls this something like creative antinomies. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but so you have, sort of a rebellious younger generation and a sturdy establishment. You have, intense critics of religion and robust forms of religious faith. And I think you can see the sort of baby boomer moment in whose shadow we all sort of exist as a moment kind of like that, where you had this period in the post-war West where, the sort of generation of Churchill and de Gaulle and Eisenhower that, fought and won this war was sort of, it seemed like a real establishment. It seemed like that, that there was sort of a strong culture there, and that may have been partially an illusion, but it certainly seemed that way to many people. And then you had this huge generation, this, just demographically huge generation sort of coming up in a moment of real technological change, real cultural change, and you had this sort of moment of rebellion that, you can, if you sit down and watch, an episode of Mad Men and then go watch the Woodstock documentary, and you said, well, if I gave this to an alien, a visitor from an alien civilization, and I said, how many years separate these two cultural artifacts, they would say, well, obviously like 275, right? The Woodstock kids are, these are different civilizations, and it's 10 years apart, right? The level of sort of energy and change that's packed into that moment of that era of the baby boomers coming of age is tremendous. But then what happens? Well, the old establishment it collapses, right? The baby boomers win. And then they sort of look around and they aren't really sure what to build in its place, I think. I'm speaking culturally. Obviously, the Great Society passed. A lot of institutional changes happened in the 1960s and 1970s. But boomer culture, I think, in many ways, it sort of assumed the existence of the establishment that it was rebelling against and didn't know what to do when it became the establishment itself. And so you fell from there, I think, into this cycle of sort of cultural repetition in many respects, where you're always reenacting this great battle against the dead hand of white male Christian authority, when white male Christian authority is increasingly pushed to the regional hinterlands, right?
You look at me when you say that.
It's just I was going to say the town of Garbutt.
Texas, so what?
You came to fight in Connecticut, so I'm here to swing back at Lubbock. But no, but this recursion isn't just a matter of sort of those ideas. It's also just the repetition even of sort of motion picture themes and topics, right? The fact that all of our pop culture now consists of reboots and recyclings of stories that were invented basically between 1935 and 1980, right? All we do is make sequels and reboots of those productions. And Star Wars starts with a baby boomer, George Lucas, doing this really amazing pastiche of sort of everything from Akira Kurosawa to Triumph of the Will to Flash Gordon, and then Lucas himself. Sorry, I'll stop in a second. But Lucas. So Lucas himself then. He does that in the 70s with Star Wars. Then in the late 1990s, he tries to do something new, right? Say what you will about the Star Wars prequels, they were different from the originals. They were trying to be this sort of sweeping political story of the fall of an empire and a trade federation's tariff policies, which Amity could write the history of, and the Coolidges of the Smoot-Hawley era in galactic politics, and it failed. Right, the prequels are just terrible movies. But at that point, the culture sort of said, well, we'll turn this over to J.J. Abrams. Right, who is sort of a figure who just exists to repeat the glory days of the baby boomers, to to sort of remake their movies over and over again. And so the Star Wars movies now are just pastiches of the original pastiche. There's nothing new going on there. And you might say, well, this is just Star Wars, but I think this applies everywhere. But I'm not sure. I think I might disagree with Yuval a little bit in that I'm not sure that we can just say, well, we're going to pass out of this moment as the baby boomers age, because you do have you then have this sort of weird demographic landscape where as birth rates fall, the sort of succeeding generations will find it harder and harder to shake off the cultural yoke of the preceding one. So that makes me suspect more than Yuval does, I think, that this moment of boomer shadow decadence could go on a long while.
Ross, I couldn't help but think when you started talking that given the personalities at the center of the current convulsion in Washington, maybe the senility to which you refer is not entirely metaphorical.
No, it's not. I mean, was it, someone had the piece about, right, our gerontocracy recently, just talking, I mean, the Democratic Party, right, the party, I believe, of youthful vigor and the rising multicultural majority is run by 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds. And the Republican Party also has some older people running it, but we can talk about that later.
I just want to make a very quick point, just in a way to ditto what Ross said, but at the time in 1968 when the Paris uprising was happening, François Mitterrand, who then was not president, I can't remember what sort of functionary he was, told the student leaders when he met with them, he said, being young doesn't last very long. You spend a lot more time being old. But the problem was, but as I see it, as a child of boomers and someone who interacts with them, is this, they are stuck in that youth loop even as they age, and that youth loop is the ever overcoming of tradition, overcoming of old order. Even as astonishingly, even as especially the rebellious boomers now, they occupy the C-suites and the corner offices, or they're deans and so on and so forth, but they're still in a rebellious mode even as the old man, whoever he was, has been utterly battered and is out of the scene. And that makes the worst kind of boomer. I went to law school, but I never practiced, but when I did work at large law firms, the most vicious kind of partner in a large law firm was the one with like the ponytail and the one ear.
There are a lot of questions, so I'll just say we should be careful of not making a caricature of liberalism. Liberalism and libertarianism are not the same thing. Markets function because of structure of contract and transparency, mandated transparency. So it's or the competition that delivers transparency, let's say. So it's not a choice between all structure and liberalism. The best liberalism makes its own structure through education and then through exchange, through civil society.
And I'd just like to put in a word for baby boomers. Because I guess I am technically one of them, and not all of us follow that model.
I would also say that part of the reason I was trying to talk about that idea of collision is that I think you could argue that much of what's wrong with the baby boomers is actually their parents' generation's fault. That in fact it's natural for youth to rebel, and that the failure was that the old establishment ended up not having what it took to sort of sustain itself through that process. I mean, you can see this, with something like the divorce revolution, right? Like the divorce revolution, it starts in the baby boomer era, but it's actually the silent generation that starts getting divorced first, right? And so on down. So I would speak up for the boomers insofar as it's really their parents who, needed to fight back.
There wasn't much of an establishment if it would be swept away by a few barefoot hippies.
Yes.
Hi there. Inspired by Mr. Ahmari's comments, I'm curious to hear your reactions to this dilemma. Is it preferable in an economy, a moral system, or a political system to have an imperfect yet unchanging law limit regulation, or to have an imperfect, perfectly changing or adapting law, regulation, limit?
It's a very good question. I suppose I'm in the former camp, if only because I'm practical enough to know that, look, stability is important for me as a citizen navigating a world, and it's also important for firms and companies. I mean, that's a serious thing, so I don't think those of us who are critics of, let's say, liberalism unbound can take lightly that issue, the fact that political experiments have costs, and instability has serious costs for people who are currently, as Ross said, things are kind of more or less going well, right? I mean, people are employed and so forth, and yet there is this deep malaise. And in attempting to fix it, in that sense, we should still be small c conservatives and be careful about the attempts to solve these kinds of malaises without regard to the costs.
If I could just add, I think that one way of thinking about this is that stability matters, the ability to adapt matters, and the question that people forget to look at is your method of adaptation itself stable? So when you have things like regular rule of law, periodic elections, well-written statutes, and those sorts of things, your ability to adapt to changing conditions is predictable and stable. When you have law that comes from executive fiat, from opaque regulatory agencies, from Supreme Courts discovering rights to this and that in the Constitution that no one ever thought of, then you have a mode of adaptation that is itself unstable and unpredictable and ends up detracting from the value of adaptability.
I saw a hand up here, right? Yeah. Or is there, I can't see because of the light.
Right there. There's one right there.
Go ahead.
Thank you all. I'm a baby boomer who grew up reading National Review. Misspent life. But Buckley and National Review brought together three strands of conservatives: the international anti-communists, the economic liberals, libertarians, and the religious conservatives, when we had a vibrant mediating institution system. A number of you have spoken about the lack of vibrant mediating systems and the feeling. What do we do? Where's the next fusion? Where do we look? I don't think Claremont Review gives it to us, and I'm not sure First Things gives it to us. But where and whom do we look? And government can create mediating institutions because that's inconsistent with what they are. But without that vibrant church or shul that creates unity outside of government, what do we do? How do we look for the next fusion?
Could I answer that? Could I try that one?
Oh, absolutely.
I feel like one topic has not been mentioned, and that topic is the great tragic commons high school. So that relates to your question. There is no common space now. High school is kind of this dangerous zone you go through, and then it's a vacuum of ideals. So into that vacuum comes what? Halloween, celebrity, Pharaoh, right? And that's the first civic experience that Americans have, unless they're off in some special high school, right? A parochial school. But the answer to the creation of a coherent community is that we have to offer better high school and college, because we can't talk if we haven't been educated, certainly not in the same way. And in this meeting, we've discussed, let's see, Cicero, Chesterton. Nobody said Burke, but I thought it. Allen Ginsberg, more or less. I would add Philip Larkin. And most of us know who those people are, sort of, right? Most high schoolers we don't provide them with an education that would have them know. Most universities do not in the absence of the old Common Core and so on. So that's what yields the desert, the craziness, the adoration of Pharaoh, and so on. We don't have a common text, the answer of how do you do that with high school. A lot of us have answers and are trying, but right now it's competing ideas of new high schools and new colleges or new formats for university admission and college. But that's where it lives. It used to be the draft, right? The Army was the universal American experience. Right now we don't have consensus that should be. So absent that, it must be work or high school and college.
Since National Review came out, maybe I should speak to that just real quickly. The truth is that in the early days of what we now call fusionism, the political coalition came along before the philosophy. So the anti-communists and the traditionalists and such were already on the same side because they identified a coalition of political interests. And one of the problems for conservatives right now, but specifically for the Republican Party, is that the old coalition doesn't make sense anymore. Simply because the social conservatives and the business people aren't really on the same side anymore. Conservatives and Republicans have a deep division about foreign policy and military, American military commitments abroad, when war is appropriate and all the rest of it. So I suspect that you will see the development of a new operational political coalition long before you see the development of a philosophy to justify such a thing, which will necessarily be filled in after the fact. I do know, though, that in the early days of National Review, as some of you know, the magazine was run by people who had been former Trotskyites. Some of them were committed libertarians. A few of them were ultramontane Catholics. But very few of them were all the same at the same time, as Sohrab is sometimes in the course of a long 3-day weekend.
One other way to look at it is that, you can see fusionism takes shape for many reasons, but above all in the shadow of a very clear and coherent foreign threat, right? That is not just a sort of the threat of a foreign power, but it's the threat of a rival ideology whose nature sort of pushes these not always ideologically coherent tendencies into coalition with one another, right? I mean, it's true that in many ways there isn't that much that a really committed believer in objectivism and reader of the Fountainhead has in common with an ultramontane Catholic. And yet they had this much in common. Soviet communism was, equally the enemy of, sort of libertarian individualism and traditional religious structures. And I have no idea, I agree with Kevin that the coalition that exists doesn't make sense. I think some of the forms of American exceptionalism that conservatism was sort of organized to defend don't really exist anymore, which also makes it tricky. But I think you can imagine, if you can see in the nature of, at least right now, what the Chinese regime represents, a point of unification for at least some people on the right who are otherwise at each other's throats, right? Encompassing certain forms of libertarians, certain forms of economic nationalists, certain forms of religious conservatives, certain kinds of foreign policy hawks and foreign policy Jacksonians. There are people in the foreign policy world who can totally disagree about the wisdom of the Iraq War or whatever we do in Syria, who may find agreement about confronting China. But what's tricky there is that China represents something very different than the Soviet Union in its relationship to sort of consumerism and big business, and you see this in the references Sohrab made, I think, to how American corporations, including our own National Basketball Association, right, relate to the Chinese regime. I think there's a segment, just as there was a segment of American business that was very happy with sort of the comfortable corporatism of the late 1950s. There's a segment of American business that is perfectly happy imagining a future of, not in their own lives, but of sort of political authoritarianism as a sort of superstructure under which the work of selling people better video games and sneakers can just continue. And so in that sense, I think even more than was the case with the original conservatism, it's hard to know if you could imagine a new fusionism that was partially organized against what China represents. It's harder to know where the people within corporate America are who would support that new fusionism would be.
All right. Yes. Or is there someone else over there where the light is blinding me? There you go.
Thanks. Great presentations. I wonder what the panel members think about the idea that this challenge you've discussed has a lot to do with the idea that a liberal, sustainable democratic society depends in part for its sustainability on pre-liberal virtues and pre-liberal phenomena. You know, faith communities, diminished sense of radical individualism, you know, as Mr. Ahmari said, a sense of limits, the kind of things that at least a prosperous liberal society tends to erode, especially in the left. This radical individualism and identity politics is just as an assault on that. And so, if that's so, how can one recreate spaces for those kinds of concepts and ways of understanding the world? As Ms. Shlaes says, the schools may be a critical place. Be curious for y'all's thoughts on that.
You're talking about progressivism, progressive liberalism, or classical liberalism? You were talking about progressive liberals, yeah.
Well, I think if you look at it just as a historical question, I think the real division is between people who think that the American polity was founded at Philadelphia and those who think it was founded at Plymouth. And I think that's really the question.
Which was it?
Well, you know, it's a hard thing for a Catholic to say, but I think the Puritans actually kind of had that one right. So, yeah. Ross hit on this earlier, and I think that that's really the fundamental question that we've come to, is that American conservatism exists to conserve the principles of the American founding, which is a certain blend of Anglo-Protestant liberalism dating from the 18th century. And it's not restricted to people who are Anglos and Protestants. I'm neither one of those things. But we have now the development of a new thing that is on the right, that is explicitly anti-liberal, which rejects fundamentally the philosophical and religious and spiritual underpinnings of the American founding, and the version of conservatism that's about conserving classical liberalism and the version of conservatism that's about whatever this thing is about, I still can't quite tell, simply aren't on the same page and are not going to be part of the same political movement for very much longer, I wouldn't imagine, and certainly not in the same political party.
Well, I mean, Sohrab may want to speak to this, but a different way to look at it would be that if liberalism depends on what we call pre-liberal forms and institutions, and if in the case of the American experiment, many of those pre-liberal forms and institutions, up to and including, you know, all of New England Puritanism, no longer exist or have been changed beyond recognition, then maybe actually liberalism depends in a weird way on the success of what we might call the post-liberals, which I think is sort of what the group that you're sort of gesturing at, and that maybe Sohrab would sometimes be associated with, right? That like we have there's this assumption right now in conservative argument that there are these sort of, you know, there's defenders of classical liberalism, and then there's people who want to set up an integralist Catholic monarchy on American shores. And since I think it's very unlikely that there will be an integralist Catholic monarchy on American shores, but it might be that the impulses that lead people to identify with the sort of primarily religious, often primarily Catholic ideas that are not necessarily part of the Philadelphian fusion might nonetheless provide the kind of substrate that classical liberalism itself needs to recover. And I admit that's somewhat fanciful. I don't think it's more fanciful than the Empire of Guadalupe, you know, extending from Chile to Quebec. So, but I think this is to go to your question. I mean, I think this is the core question, right? If liberalism depends on pre-liberal sources, and the pre-liberal sources are exhausted, how do you get them back? And I don't know the answer, but it might be that in some of the post-liberal forays, there is part of that answer, Potentially.
It's optimism, and I will have no part of it.
I assume.
So I have two thoughts on this. One is to give an optimistic gloss to your question, and it's this, that if indeed a lot of the institutions that we value about liberal modernity have roots in a pre-liberal world, as indeed they do, they had markets in pre-modern times. They had legislatures. Due process, not as we would understand it, but nevertheless due process. It also
the witch floated. She got to. No, sorry.
That if we move beyond ideological liberalism, and I'll get to what that might be, if we can get beyond ideological liberalism, it need not mean that we lose the institutions that we love. Now, what is ideological liberalism, and how do I distinguish it from whatever else is percolating on the right? I would put the division between whether you think the aim of politics is merely to uphold procedures and maximize individual rights, come what may, obscene abortion laws, straight up infanticide, going from gay marriage being unthinkable to not only is it thinkable, but if you question it, you'll be hounded out of the public square, to now there's this bizarre thing where polyamorous relationships are just at the kind of very mainstream of the culture being sort of normalized. So that's the kind of, I would say, a minimalist, narrow proceduralist ideology that's brought us to this place that Ross outlined in his talk. And then the other side would be a substantive vision that says the good is knowable and government's primary job is to enact the good. Now, procedural limitations on government are part of the good. We can't deny that. But to say that that all the good is procedural limits on government and individual rights is too narrow a reading of the good. So that's, I think, an interesting division, and that's what's playing out. So what is the substantive vision? I think I've tried to outline some things. I think others have as well, and that it's a valuable discussion. But I think there is a clear boundary line between what I just set forth, and I think where Kevin and others are.
Sohrab, I wonder if you've considered, though, that if you think that government's job is to enact the good, which is a pretty big and difficult mission, is that at all complicated by the fact that you just got a really stunning demonstration of the fact that government can't operate a train between New York and Connecticut?
However, he also experienced in Bolt Bus the conspicuous failure of the free market alternative. So
that's right. It's both let me down.
Failure all the way down.
I got here on Uber and it worked just fine.
No, but I mean, I think I've encountered a lot of arguments in response to my the ideas I've put forward the past few months where people say, government can't legislate morality. Oh yeah? Why do we have laws against fraud? Why do we have laws against murder? Right? So, I mean, I think that's a very, now you might have the most kind of minimal libertarian account of why we have those laws. But nevertheless, even that is a philosophical, moral proposition. It's not, it's not just an abstraction that you pulled out. You have a philosophical vision of who people are and what their rights are and so forth. And so we always are legislating morality, have always done so. And even the progressives in their own way, they have a sense that they're legislating the good. So my point is that we can't just, in the face of especially a movement that it has this kind of messianic sense of it's legislating the good, it's good for marriage to be redefined and so forth, for us to say, oh no, I just stand on procedure, there's an imbalance there. We propose procedure, they have a substantive vision.
Well, here's a rebuttal. I mean, I would say our topic, because we're coming to our close, could have been, is progressivism. That's what I thought you meant first, a casualty of its own success, because the sheer absurdity of current progressivism, we just banned also in New York very moral foie gras, I think, the pâté.
Yes, while shipping off people in the streets to other cities.
Right.
Yeah.
We see daily the limits of doing good, however good is defined, through the current progressive impulse. So I see a lot of people saying, pull back, rather than emulate what progressives are currently doing. I'm talking about in national government or in municipal government, so, because the results are so unlivable. So I think there's room for a discussion. That's what I would say, Sohrab.
But here's a way of thinking about it, right? I mean, you started this, and we've now taken over from our questioners, so we should go back to them. But you started by talking about education, right, and sort of the collapse of sort of small L liberal education in the schools. I think one of the questions that sort of maybe divides some conservatives in Sohrab's cohort from conservatives in the sort of older fusionist camp would be, well, what do you do about that, right? I mean, for 50 or 60 years, conservatives, when it comes to public education, have been the party that defends local control of schools against progressive, as you say, progressive bureaucrats, administrators, and so on. And to the extent that if the perception among critics of progressivism like yourself is that this has failed, then, is there an argument that we should want not Betsy DeVos maybe, but Betsy DeVos 2.0 in the Josh Hawley administration saying we're going to have a national curriculum in high schools, and we're going to do No Child Left Behind Part 3, and it's going to be all about making high schoolers read Philip Larkin. I don't think that's what we would do, but I mean, how do you? And I mean, this. I could
hear the poem. You know the poem, right?
Yes.
But the poem is obscene, so we may not repeat it. One answer is competition. There are plenty of people right now who are contemplating alternates to the College Board, because the College Board is the tyranny that's more important, as important as the tyranny, say, of teacher unions, so often vilified. I think through competition and the quest for excellence, you can find reform. It doesn't have to be mandated by Secretary Spellings. It comes from parents. Schools don't come from government; they come from parents.
What if the parents were educated in those same schools and therefore don't have the resources to create the local schools that teach obscene poems by Philip Larkin?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, again, not that, but I mean, this is sort of the question: if conservatism goes through a period of cultural failure, then conservatism ceases to be able to rely on the culture, and out of that you get, I think, we can call it reaction instead of conservatism, that says, well, all we have now are the levers of state power, and we need to use them.
Well, a good example, I'm just trying to think of examples within education, are the basis schools. Is anyone here from a basis school? The basis schools were invented by a couple about 30 years ago, and they work backwards from the test, which happens to be AP or bio or whatever. And they kind of reinvented the whole school more towards knowledge, and they have become more important than the communities they are in. They're charter schools and voucher schools and private schools. They're private basic schools. They were founded by a couple called Michael and Olga Bloch. Olga Bloch was an East European who knew well what communism was and wanted Americans to be educated enough to defend against socialism. So very fiery, right? Very correct. And these schools, if you look in U.S. News and Report, in the top 10 not private schools, top 10 public schools in the United States, 5 of them are basis schools. And those of us who look at college applications see a far a disproportionate number of qualified candidates from these schools, which are not particularly for rich kids. They're not the private boarding schools that would traditionally field Yale, for example. I believe, just as I believe that a cryptocurrency or a currency pegged to a commodity with a sovereign hanging on will replace the dollar, that a new education system will come, and the less it's part of government, the better. But the second part is parental responsibility. It's our job to be sure our communities know these things, and certainly someone whose parent doesn't know Cicero can still enjoy Cicero.
So it seems like there's sort of 2 modal critiques of liberalism right now. And one critique is that there's way too much pluralism, and we have a kind of anarchic anti-culture where there just is no culture because everyone's doing their own thing. Then there's another critique, which is that, no, actually liberalism has homogenized the culture to such a degree that there's essentially no pluralism. And those two critiques seem to be at least notionally on the surface in tension with each other. So my question to really all the panelists is, which of those stories, if either, do you think is more true right now? And is there a way potentially of reconciling them?
I think there might be a little question begging in that, in the sense that the decline in culture and this, new sort of hysterical homogeneity and conformism, or the general decline into crassness and ugliness and stupidity and low standards and all the rest of the things we associate with American life in 2019, maybe it doesn't have anything to do with the form of government. You see these in places that have much more active and less liberal governments. You see it in places that have more liberal governments. So it may be that the changes in culture that we are here bemoaning aren't actually directly related to questions about form and structure and administration of government, which I suspect probably is the case. But if it's not the case, it's almost certainly the case that the changes in culture are leading the changes in politics, not the other way around.
Yeah, I sort of agree with Kevin, I think, in the sense that I tend to, I think abstract arguments about the nature of regimes need to be always qualified by discussions of what is technology doing in this moment in history. I was talking earlier about demographics. There's just a lot of forces at work besides the worldview that sort of hangs around in people's heads. And clearly the biggest force shaping culture one way or another, and I think shaping both of those experiences you're describing, right? This feeling of crazy atomization and this feeling of homogeneity is the internet, right? The internet, on the one hand, it gives everyone a Twitter feed and everyone a Facebook page, and we don't have blogs anymore, I guess, but it used to give everyone a blog. On the other hand, its economic consequences for the culture are good for the New York Times and bad for every local newspaper, good for Taylor Swift and bad for every mid-sized touring band. And so it both sort of creates, on the one hand, a sense of hyper-individualization and a sense of this conformity, which then sometimes is sort of exacerbated by the mobs that Kevin has written eloquently about and maybe occasionally experienced. But that's the internet, right? Is the internet liberalism? The internet is the internet is the one big new invention of a society that used to throw off more inventions and now doesn't. And I don't know how far you can chase its consequences down and come to an analysis of the regime. And in many ways, you probably want to go, as Kevin says, the opposite direction and say, what is the internet doing to liberalism?
I would just say the effect of the internet is overrated, so I'm going to disagree, and the effect of education is underrated.
And I think we're out of time.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. I didn't, so go.
Speak up for mental.
I don't have.
You were going to say something.
I would just say that the tension you identify is real. I suppose, again, if I had to pick, I'm in the camp. Adrian Vermeil of Harvard puts it well that liberalism increasingly feels like one of the world's great religions, and so if you identify the various phenomena that you look at, and they seem so disconsonant and crazy, if you actually sort of analyze them, they begin to look like kind of liturgical, sacramental movements, but just different expressions for different, anyway. But the tension you identify is real, and that's too simplistic an answer, and I'm out of time, so thank you.
Thank you very much.